Yes. Welcome, Caterina.
Okay, testing. Testing. Good? Okay. Thank you. So we have a little cartoon up, and it's good to start the day with a little bit of levity. So the Earth has a fever, and you can see the Earth visiting the doctor, and the doctor says it's time to seek attention right away because the Earth has a fever. So I have a question for you just to get things going. So with the show of hands, how many people agree that the Earth has a fever, that we have global warming? Okay, thank you. And how many people would say that we need to pay attention? Okay, wonderful. So the Earth has warmed. The global average temperatures are now 1 degree Celsius higher than they were last century. And the United Nations has a target to limit the warming to no more than 2 degrees and possibly only 1.5 degrees Celsius. So some people are saying that's kind of weird. If you've got a fever, don't you really want to get rid of the fever? So that is what we're going to hope to do, but I think humanity is kind of saying, well, let's get it under control first, and then we'll look at reversing it later. Food is a way that we can reverse the fever, and that's my message to you today. I think it's one of empowerment because we do have control over what food we eat, more so than, for example, getting a carbon fee on carbon pollution or something like that that you need to persuade the government. So the title of the presentation is Eating to be Kinder to the Earth, and right now I'll just go over the agenda of what I'll cover today. The first thing I'll be covering is a food system overview that looks at the question of where we get our food. You might answer, well, we get our food at the supermarket, but where does the supermarket get its food? Or maybe you go to the farmer's market, and where does it come from? The next thing I'll be covering is the Oxford study on reducing food's environmental impacts. This was a groundbreaking study just released recently, and it shows how different foods impact the environment in different ways. And finally, I'll be covering, are we ready to make the switch? Perfect. Okay. This is an illustration of our food system in that here's the number of people in the U.S. population that are farmers and just the number of people in the U.S. population. So and this mirrors what happened in Canada as well. Back in 1890, 47% of the population was involved being farmers, producing our food. Right now, it's less than 1%. So that's kind of, in some ways, a wonderful achievement because whereas before 53% of people could do things other than just working to keep us fed, now we've got 99% of people that can do other things besides working to get us fed. Culture, the arts, writing, and so on, business. And the reason that we've been able to reduce the number of people, both in absolute numbers and percentages, of farmers is that we have machinery and we have chemical fertilizers. Now the chemical fertilizers have a downside, of course. They contribute to water pollution, air pollution, and also pollution of our land. And the way that we've done chemical fertilizers comes a lot from fossil fuels. So we're going to have to think about that long and hard, whether we want to continue in that direction, because chemical fertilizers are derived from fossil fuels, and we want to stop using those, and they're getting more scarce. This graph shows that as the number of farms has declined, the average size has increased. So the number of farms in the U.S. used to be 6 million. Now there's 2 million. But the average size of the farm has gone from 150 acres to 450 acres. And the number of commodities per farm has also decreased. It used to be 5 commodities per farm, and now it's only 1. So when farmers grew more than 1 commodity, they could perhaps rotate their crops as a way to keep the soil fertile. And now there's a heavy reliance on chemical fertilizers. This graph shows meat consumption since 1961, and it's global meat consumption per capita. So during this time, our population has more than doubled, and you see that meat consumption has more than doubled. And we're now at 40 kilograms per person per year. And that's globally. So some people eat a lot less than that, and some people, mainly in Canada and the United States and Europe, eat a lot more than that. So since 1961, our meat production is now 424% of what it used to be. And that has a big impact on our planet. This is just showing the growth of our population and resource use in 100-year intervals. So back in 1812, we had 1 billion people on the planet. By 1912, it increased 50% to 1.5 billion. But then 100 years later, we're at 7 billion. So just an exponential growth in the number of people. However, because we have 7 times more people doesn't mean we use 7 times more resources. Our resource use is not even. With our current food system, we have a problem in that 800 million people are malnourished. A quarter of the world's children are stunted due to malnutrition, so they don't grow to their full potential physically or mentally. And we have 500 million people that are obese. So I would point to these factors as things that's saying our food system is broken and we need to change it. These graphs here just show increases in different environmental resources and just how much they've grown exponentially. So we have water use, which has grown a lot, transportation, the use of fertilizer, paper, plastic, and primary energy use. So these graphs are just showing in a kind of a sterile way, a mathematical way, that our resource use on the earth is growing way too much, and it's more than what our planet can handle, which is why we've got a planet that's in decline. Here are some other signs of planetary health or sickness, if you will. The first graph shows territorial biosphere degradation, so that means the amount of land that wild animals can live on. The next one is marine fish capture, which has grown exponentially even though we've got like collapse of fish stocks. We don't seem to sort of take that into account very well. Carbon dioxide, which is making the planet retain more heat. So that's something we definitely want to reduce to get rid of the Earth's fever. Ocean acidification. Now, ocean acidification is caused by the increased carbon dioxide because some of that carbon dioxide that's going into the atmosphere is being absorbed by the oceans, and that makes the oceans more acidic. And this is problematic for shellfish that have bones made out of calcium and like exoskeletons, because that calcium will dissolve if the pH level is too high. And lastly, we have the use of tropical forests, which is a concern because tropical forests store carbon and are also homes to the most biodiverse places on the planet. So we really don't want to be losing our tropical forests. Okay, this slide's self-explanatory. It's just how much food can you grow on 1.5 acres of land? And if you grow plant-based food, you can produce 37,000 pounds. But if you do raise a cow or a cattle, 1.5 acres can produce 375 pounds of meat. So the production of meat is very inefficient from a land use point of view. And if we want to feed everybody, that's something that we need to consider. This is the billions of pounds of food per day that's consumed by 7 billion people, or the 1.5 billion cows on our planet. Each cow eats 90 pounds of food per day, so 90 times 1.5 is 135 billion pounds. And the 7 billion people eat 3 pounds of food per day, which is 21 billion pounds. Now, to be fair, cows eat grass. Some of their diet is grass, and people can't eat grass. However, 1/4 of the grain that's grown in the third world is fed to livestock. 82% of the starving people live in countries that feed some of their grain to livestock, and then that livestock is exported to first world countries. And globally, half the grain in the world is fed to livestock. So if we valued kind of people having enough food more than kind of our pleasure, if you will, of eating meat, then we wouldn't do that. This chart shows the world's most serious dead zones. When we have the dead zones are caused by animal waste running off into waters or by chemical fertilizers running off. And at first it creates an abundance of life, of plant life, of algae, but then the algae grows too quickly and actually depletes the water of oxygen and creates a dead zone. So we've got a lot of dead zones throughout the world, and we'd have a lot less of them if we had a lot less animal waste and chemical fertilizers, particularly animal waste, being dumped into the rivers and oceans. Okay, animal agriculture is responsible for 91% of the destruction of the Amazon. The Amazon is being lost at the rate of 1 to 2 acres per second. And what happens is for the Amazon's being cut down either to grow feed for cattle or just to ranch, to make cattle ranches. It results in a loss of habitat as well as releasing a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, especially if the forests are cleared by clear cutting and then burning. We're losing about 100 species per day, and extinction is forever. In fact, scientists are now saying that we're in the midst of the 6th great extinction. So there have been 5 previous great extinctions where a lot of flora and fauna were lost, and now we're experiencing the 6th one. Okay, the meat and dairy industries combined use nearly 1/3 of all the fresh water in the world today. And that's a problem. We are having, with climate change, water shortages. One of the causes of the Syrian war, like not the only cause, but one of them was the fact that 2 million farmers in rural Syria didn't have enough water to farm their land, and then they came into the cities, and then there ended up being conflict. Also, there are glaciers that feed lots of people, not feed, but provide water to lots of people in India and China. And those are expected to lose 30% of their mass by the end of the century. And that's only if we keep warming to 1.5 degrees. If we have more warming, more of those glaciers will be lost. And that's going to lead to conflict and resource wars likely. Now I want to share with you some information about the Oxford Food Study. It was a really well done study, and so we're going to go into it in a little bit of detail. It was a 5-year study, and it uses life cycle analysis. So what the researchers wanted to do was answer the question, is there such thing as sustainable animal agriculture? How can we measure it? How sustainable is animal agriculture compared to growing plants? And what are the implications? And can we maybe it's unrealistic to expect people to go vegan, but maybe if we could put better labeling on products, that would help. So this study covers 90% of the world's food production, so it's quite extensive. And it measures environmental impact across 5 indicators. The first one is greenhouse gas emissions. So how much greenhouse gas emissions are used to produce a unit of food. The next one is land use. So, because that's an important consideration. We only have a finite amount of land on Earth. Terrestrial acidification, that's a fancy word for acid rain. So how much of the soil is being acidified because of sulfur dioxide that's released when we use some chemical fertilizers. And lastly, eutrophication, that means those ocean dead zones that we talked about earlier, so it's water pollution basically that's killing the oceans and rivers. And the last one is water use, and it's weighted by how scarce the resource is in that particular area. Okay, so here are some charts showing the different impacts for different types of foods. And the part of the top is kind of the worst offenders, which is beef and lamb, and depends on whether the beef was in a herd or a beef herd or a dairy herd. And you can also see that the impact varies. So there's some beef, like even within one category, it goes across and has a big spread of impact. And for example, 25% of the beef producers produce 56% of the impact. So there's a variety of impacts. But even the best beef producers have more of an impact than the worst producers of beans or nuts. So by moving towards plant-based proteins, you would save on greenhouse gas emissions. You can see that the land use is a lot less. The terrestrial acidification is much better. The water use is better. And same with eutrophication. The idea with the spread of different impacts within a category is that we could then have labeling on products showing the environmental impact. And then that way consumers can decide whether they want to buy that particular product that has such a big carbon footprint, or even if they are going to eat beef, to look for a lower carbon footprint. The person who created the study said that we can have a big impact based on our dietary choices, more than getting an electric car or reducing our flights. And not only do you save on greenhouse gases, but on all 5 indicators by moving towards a plant-based diet. This chart just shows within different foods what the impact is. So the one at the top under B shows that cow milk has way bigger impact than soy milk. So that's a change that people could make to reduce their environmental impact. Then it shows different oils, how much impact they have, and different types of fruits and vegetables. And I'll point out that these scales are different. So the one for the milks is much higher than the one for the fruit and vegetables. So one thing that the people that did this study noticed was that the meat, eggs, dairy, and aquaculture, so they also studied aquaculture, it uses 83% of the farmland, but it produces only 18% of the calories. So in a way, that's very inefficient, and it means that there's an opportunity here. And the opportunity is that with vegan diets, we could free up 79% of the farmland. So what could we do with that 79% of the farmland? One idea is just to let it go back to forest and to have it rewild. According to Salish Rayo, who's one of the co-producers of the film Cowspiracy, he calculated that having that much farmland revert back to forest would store enough carbon to offset all the emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. In essence, reversing the Earth's fever. As an added bonus, it would reduce agricultural freshwater use by 20%. And it would reduce agriculture's greenhouse gases, water pollution, and air pollution by about half. So we could have a big impact there. During the study, they kind of asked the questions, well, what are the factors that make animals more resource intensive than plants? And I think that's important to understand. So one is conversion to edible protein ratio is at least 2 to 1. So in other words, we use energy to keep that animal alive, and so that's kind of where that's why it's more efficient to eat the plants ourselves than to feed an animal first. Secondly, 2/3 of our deforestation is due to animal agriculture. So they just need more land. And here's some other things. Enteric fermentation, so in other words, belching, is also a greenhouse gas, methane, which is more powerful than carbon dioxide, although it's shorter lived in the atmosphere. Manure is a big problem. Aquaculture ponds produce emissions as well. Then there's higher emissions just for processing an animal compared to plant food. And lastly, animal products are more prone to spoilage. Okay, so the researcher for the Oxford study, it was a 5-year project, and after a year of studying this and trying to find sustainable animal agriculture practices, Joseph Poor decided to become vegan. And he also said, to summarize the study, a vegan diet is probably the single biggest way to reduce your impact on planet Earth. Not just greenhouse gases, but global acidification, eutrophication, land use, and water use. Okay. So recently the IPCC came out with a report, their 2018 report, about what the world would look like if we actually hit 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees. And this is showing what our emission trajectory would have to look like. In other words, it has to peak very quickly and reduce almost to zero within the next 12 years. And then we have to have negative emissions. And then that'll keep us to 1.5 degrees. So you can see that we need a huge amount of action. I believe, and a lot of economists agree, that we need a price on carbon pollution, which Canada is kind of walking towards tentatively. We've got some provincial, federal lawsuits happening, but should the courts rule in favor of the federal government, which I think it will, because we have signed an international agreement that said we'll limit emissions to no more than 2 and hopefully 1.5 degrees. So we need a strong price on carbon. And then we also need a shift to plant-based diets. That's really critical to get our emissions down and to store more carbon. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears and talk about this, can we make the switch? So here's some interesting research. It just came out in 2018 out of Dalhousie University. How often do Canadians consume meat? And 2% of people said never, so they're vegans. Less than once a month is 3%, and once or twice a month is 6%. So we've got 11% of the population that eats meat no more than twice a month, which I think is pretty good. Then we have 40% of people saying they only eat meat once or twice a week, and 49% say they eat meat daily. So what that's telling me is that people might try like this Meatless Monday thing, which means they would eat meat maybe 6 days a week instead of 7. But they must quickly evolve into eating meat only once or twice a month. So they must be finding that they feel better, it's less expensive, maybe they feel better about not harming the animals, maybe they feel better about the reduced environmental footprint. So that gives me some hope that there are a lot of people in the once or twice a week category. Okay, so now it's time again for audience participation. Making the switch. So according to that same survey, how many Canadians do you think plan to reduce their meat consumption within the next 6 months? Is it, and we've got a choice, A is 8%, B is 16%, C is 32%. Okay, so how many people think 8%? Okay, thank you, a lot of you. How many people think 16%? Okay, a few more. How about 32%? You are right. There's only one person who got the right answer. Yay! Okay, thank you. So that's astounding. 32% of people plan to reduce their meat consumption within the next 6 months. So a lot of people do things because there's sort of a social license to do it. They'll only do it if everyone else is. So when we have 32% of people saying they're going to reduce their meat consumption within the next 6 months, I think that's the start of a bigger movement and something to celebrate. Okay, another thing I wanted to talk about was Beyond Burger. The Beyond Burger was developed to kind of mimic meat, so it tastes a lot like meat for people that really like the taste of meat but want to reduce their environmental impact. And I have some statistics here showing you whether that worked. So the chart shows that greenhouse gas emissions are much lower for the Beyond Burger compared to beef patty. The land use is a lot less. The characterized water use is also a lot less. And the energy use is about half. So I think it does score good points on being more environmentally friendly. I don't eat a lot of fast food myself, but recently we were on vacation and we were going by an A&W, so we asked, do you have a Beyond Burger? And they said, oh, we're sold out at this point. All across Canada, we won't have them again until October. So we came back in October and then we tried the Beyond Burger. And I thought, yeah, it tastes like a hamburger. And so I could see where people who like meat could try the Beyond Burger. It was a little bit more expensive than a regular burger. Now, given that it uses less resources, it shouldn't be more expensive. But I think we're just paying for the research and development costs at this point, and perhaps the price will go down as time goes on. I'm just going to share with you some resources for more information. So the first one is the Oxford Food Study, so I encourage you to look that up and get more information about that. The second one is the movie Cowspiracy, which talks about the environmental impact of animal agriculture. And the title Cowspiracy is kind of based on the illusion. It alludes to the fact that there might be a conspiracy about why a lot of environmental organizations were not talking about the impact of meat. I think that's changed a lot actually since this documentary first came out. And lastly, another good resource is www.vegan26.com, 2026.com. This is based on Dr. Salish Rayo and his vision for a vegan world by 2026 to reduce global warming. And you might say, wow, 8 years, that's not a very long time to have such a fundamental shift. But he points out to the fact that John F. Kennedy came out and said, by the end of the decade, which was only 8 years away, we're going to put a man on the moon, and we did. And also, the speed at which the internet technology took off. And Dr. Salish Rayo actually worked on that challenge. And within 8 years, the internet was a very, very common thing from when they first started. Okay, so that's the end of the slideshow. So I'm going to take any questions or comments. Oh, the GMO crops could have a lower impact than conventional crops? No, I think that's hype. The GMO crops maybe are set up so that they can have, they're resistant to a certain pesticide, and then the farmer would have to then spray that pesticide quite often to have the crop unaffected. I'm also worried about the fact that there hasn't been long-term testing of GMOs. So it seems a little risky to me to do that. Yeah, I think so. I think we are going to, eating more plants would be wonderful from sort of sequestering carbon and so on. But if we really want to get at the pollution issues and the phasing out of fossil fuels, we'll have to reduce our reliance on chemical fertilizers. So we will need to do things like maintain and improve the fertility of the soil. Fertile soil actually stores more carbon than the infertile soil. So that's another way to sequester carbon. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay, Kevin? No. I rely on peer-reviewed scientific literature. Okay. All right.
Yeah.